The US military has a history full of crazy surprises, from its unexpected origins to its game-changing innovations. Get ready to uncover 25 mind-blowing facts that highlight just how extraordinary the most powerful force on Earth truly is. Here we go. Number 1. The US military is actually older than the US itself. Hang on, how can that be true? Surely a country needs to establish itself as a nation in order to get an army, right? Well, it turns out that the rich and erratic history of the early United States, before they could even be called as such, allowed for some crazy things to happen. The US Armed Forces, the collective term for all branches of the US military, headquartered in the Pentagon, traces its roots back to June 14, 1775. That's just a bit before the year that the US declared independence from the British, when the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution to create an army for the then 13 colonies. The army, called the Continental Army, was made up of soldiers from all the colonies and was led by George Washington. The army's main goal was to defend the colonies against the British in the American Revolutionary War. After the United States won its independence, the Continental Army, then joined by the Continental Marines and the Continental Navy, was demobilized in 1784. On June 3rd of the same year, Congress created the United States Army, as they're known today, by making them the effective successor of the Continental Army. The United States Navy and Marine Corps were created later, but followed the origins of the Continental Army closely. Not all aspects of the US Army are as old as the country itself, some are pretty much brand new. Number 2. The US military has a space division. On December 20, 2019, then-President Donald Trump signed the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, which led to the creation of the 6th and newest branch of the US Armed Forces, called the US Space Force. Based on the name, you might be thinking that this branch of the US military is prepared to fight off aliens or destroy asteroids before they can devastate the Earth. The truth is somewhere in the middle, but is relatively mundane. The US Space Force is primarily an intelligence-based branch of the US military. Its goal is to protect the US assets orbiting Earth, such as military satellites. A major part of maintaining these satellites is to provide more accurate information on what is happening on Earth rather than up in space. The satellite gathers intelligence on enemy military movements or military base locations and should ideally be among the first to detect missile launches. Of course, there's no telling what the future might hold, so we might be seeing the US military take a more active spacefaring approach as well. Until then, we're firmly on Earth, and the US military certainly has a significant presence there as well. Number 3. The US military is present in roughly 40% of the countries on Earth. There's a reason why the US is called the world's peacekeeping force. Out of roughly 200 countries in the world, depending on who you ask to define the term for you, US military bases can be found in 80 of them, and the number of those bases a whopping 750. But there's more to that when it comes to outlining the sheer presence of the US military in the world. While the US is not currently involved in any wars, official or not, the US still actively deploys soldiers for various missions. In some countries, primarily the Middle East, a bulk of that presence is to combat terrorism and defend governments against revolutionaries. According to a 2021 report by Al Jazeera, the US has deployed more than 173,000 soldiers across 159 countries in total. Some of that presence might be considered a bit weird. For example, there were roughly 50,000 troops stationed in Germany by 2024, a country in the middle of the EU and NATO. So what gives? Number 4. The US military boosts local economies. Considering the sheer amount of troops stationed in a military base, most bases that are not in active war zones or don't see heavy enemy fire end up being supported by the local community. One of the best examples is Germany. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US has considered closing down some military bases in Germany. To that end, the military more than halved the number of deployed troops, from roughly 70,000 in 2006 to 34,000 in 2021. However, the Germans had strong opinions about the US completely leaving the country. Due to the number of troops stationed, many soldiers brought their families with them. Soon after, some of the military bases became towns in and of themselves. These towns were supported by both the US government and the local industry. If the military bases were to be abandoned, it would cause an upheaval in the local economy. Speaking of large economies, the US military doesn't just provide benefits overseas. Number 5. The US Armed Forces is the country's biggest employer. There are only a few companies in the US that can claim to have more than 1 million employees. While you might be thinking that some of the giants like ExxonMobil, McDonald's, or even the United States Postal Service would surely manage to get to that number, the reality is a bit different. There are only 2 such companies in America, in fact. The second largest employer is the shopping chain giant Walmart, with 1.5 million employees. However, the US military has over 2 million employees. When put together, 5 federal departments, Defense, Justice, Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, and the Treasury, employ close to 3 million people. That's close to 1% of the country's total population. But how many of those people are actually soldiers? Number 6, the US military doesn't have the most soldiers in the world. According to most recent statistics, the US military has 1.32 million active personnel. That's more than half of the total number of employees this branch of the government has. However, it's not the country with the most soldiers overall. That honor goes to China, which has 2.04 million active personnel. The next is India, with 1.45 million. However, when comparing the total population against the number of active soldiers, the US easily overtakes those two countries. Number 7, the US military enlists close to 150,000 people each year. Considering just how many troops the US military has in active and reserve duty at all times, it stands to reason that there's a constant influx of fresh faces. According to the statistics for 2020, roughly 150,000 people enlisted in the Army. This comes from over 205,000 applications, meaning that the US Army has enlisted roughly 73% of the applicants. The discrepancy is based on 2 reasons. First, mandatory health screening means that some people simply can't be accepted into the military in the first place. The second is the US Boot Camp, or Basic Combat Training, or its equivalent, the One Station Unit Training, OSUT. Together, the boot camps test the physical and mental fortitude of all future troops. Between 11 and 14% of all people who enter the boot camp never make it to graduation. But don't let that discourage you from trying to join. Number 8, you don't have to be in peak physical condition to get into boot camp. The 10-week boot camp and the 22-week OSUT are grueling and designed to push the human body to the limit of its potential. However, that doesn't mean that all applicants are in peak physical form with rippling muscles. The boot camps typically accept applicants who fulfill a few conditions on basic physical fitness. But if the boot camps are strapped for applicants, the training is designed to transform any civilian off the street into a combat-ready soldier. Also, just because the boot camp typically lasts 10 weeks, that doesn't mean that you're immediately out if you don't graduate then. The drill sergeants can set some trainees aside to work with later groups and more customized training. The US Navy even accepts applicants who don't know how to swim, as that's a relatively basic skill that's taught quickly. Number 9, the draft was abolished after the Vietnam War. Speaking of taking people off the street, the US military used to have a compulsory draft in the 20th century. The last such draft was enacted between 1940 and 1973, as the US military needed more men than the number who signed for voluntary duty. Arguably the biggest draft happened during World War II, when the US military had 49 million men registered for the war, of whom 10 million were inducted into military service. At one point, roughly 900,000 men were in boot camps at once. In later decades, roughly 95% of the servicemen were there voluntarily, so the military typically has more than enough applicants. Number 10, nearly all men are required to register with the US military. Even though military service in the US is voluntary today, men between the ages of 18 and 25 have to register with the US military. This includes immigrants, foreign-born Americans, refugees, and even people with disabilities. This is because while the US military stopped drafting men into the Army in 1970, US federal law still permits compulsory conscription when needed. This is called selective service, allowing the US military to snap up thousands of recruits in days should the situation demand it. However, this selective service doesn't include women, despite women now being allowed in the Army and allowed to perform many of the same roles. Number 11. Women have posed as men to be in the Army. Women have had a rocky history with the US military. While fighting in the Army was traditionally considered a man's job, there were some women who wanted to defend their country by their side. The first women to join the Army did so by disguising themselves as men. It would appear that the physical tests were much laxer in the 19th century. By some estimates, between 400 and 750 women fought in the Civil War. The first women to officially join were doctors and nurses. The Army Nurse Corps became an official part of the US Army in 1901. The first woman to receive a commission in the regular Army was Florence Blanchfield in 1947, and women became regular members of the Army in the following year. Number 12. Not all US soldiers are humans. Weird as it may sound, not all service personnel in the Army are men or women. Some of the most loyal and reliable members of the US military are dogs. The Army currently has over 2,500 canine officers. The dogs sniff out explosives, but they're also trained to bite and subdue enemies if needed. It's estimated that each dog saves between 150 and 1,800 lives by warning the troops of mines and other dangers ahead. However, there are also service dogs that don't get deployed onto the front lines. The military also uses service and therapy dogs, as well as mascots for various units and branches. Bulldogs named Chesty are mascots of the US Marine Corps, for example. The US military also uses robots or semi-autonomous machines. There are various designs of robots used in the army, each with a different purpose. Flying drones have become synonymous with modern warfare, but there are also robots for disarming or triggering explosives and even evacuating victims. Number 13. The US has been in wars for over 90% of its existence. Considering the US military has been around for roughly 250 years, what has it been up to all that time? Surprisingly much, actually. Troops have been deployed for 222 out of 250 years of its existence. More precisely, there have been less than 30 years when the US military didn't have a deployment. Not all of these deployments were active wars. The US has only declared war on 5 occasions: the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish War, World War I, and World War II. Still, the US military has been deployed to over 300 operations, with perhaps the most famous being the War on Terrorism, with troops being deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Number 14. 31 presidents have been in the military. The President of the United States is automatically given the position of the Commander-in-Chief of the US Armed Forces. This is regardless of the person's existing military experience or training. However, out of the 45 people to take that title, 31 have served in the US military in one way or another, starting with the first. In fact, after World War I, there were 48 consecutive years where the president has been someone who has been in active military service. Out of the most recent 5, though, only one has served in the military: George W. Bush, who served in the Air National Guard as a first lieutenant. Number 15. George Washington is still the highest-ranking officer. But let's go back to the first president, George Washington. His situation as the commander of the US military, or the Continental Army as it was called at the time, and the first president didn't come easy. In fact, he didn't originally want to take the reins of the country. Despite extensive experience as a general and a military strategist, becoming a colonel in 1755, Washington's plan after America's Declaration of Independence was to retire and live away from politics. To commemorate the first president's successes, the US government elected to retroactively give Washington the highest military ranking possible in 1976 and stated that no officer should outrank him. Effectively, this gave George Washington, who was dead for roughly 180 years at the time, the first and only 6-star general rank, although the rank was never specified as such. But George Washington isn't the only interesting person to be responsible for the US military being in the state it's in today. Number 16. One of the original creators of the US Army was gay. To improve the status and the standing of the Continental Army, George Washington appointed Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben to serve as the military's Inspector General in 1788. Von Steuben was given the monumental task of ensuring that the military stood strong in the darkest days of the Revolution. Hailing from Prussia, von Steuben already had a solid military career as a captain in the Prussian army. However, it's believed that at the time of his arrival in the colonies, he was fleeing the French clergy for being homosexual. Indeed, homosexuality, then typically termed sodomy, was considered a crime both in Europe and what would become the United States, and would typically preclude a man from serving in the army. Neither Benjamin Franklin, who introduced von Steuben to Washington, nor the future president seemed to care about the rumors or dismiss them entirely. Number 17. The youngest US soldier was 12 years old. Typically, only men over the age of 18 can serve in the military. However, that didn't stop teenagers from trying their luck in serving their country, especially during World War II, when the US had one of the highest numbers of troops ever. But even then, the youngest World War II soldier was Calvin Graham, who enlisted at the age of 12 and served aboard the USS North Dakota. To get to the youngest ever soldier, we have to go back further into the American Civil War. John Lincoln Clem ran away from home at the age of 9, attempting to become a part of the military. He was rejected by 2 different units for his small size, obviously due to his age. However, he stuck by the 22nd Michigan Infantry, which eventually allowed him to serve as the drummer boy. Officers chipped in to give him the regular soldier pay, and he was enlisted at the age of 12. Clem eventually attained the rank of Major General. Number 18. The military puts condoms in survival kits. While it might sound weird at first, condoms have proven to be remarkably useful for surviving in the wilderness, and were issued in soldier kits from 1930 onward. Beyond the obvious use of protecting against sexually transmitted diseases, a latex condom is surprisingly sturdy for its size and malleability. Condoms can cover rifle barrels to prevent mud and other debris from clogging the rifle, which could have devastating consequences. They also make excellent waterproof containers for smaller items. One major use for condoms was to protect fuses from getting wet before they could be detonated. Finally, a condom can inflate to a volume of more than a liter and can hold water relatively easily, so it can be used as a makeshift canteen. Number 19. Ray-Bans were made for the US Air Force. Apart from using relatively mundane items for military use, the US military has also been responsible for a few remarkable inventions. The first of these is Ray-Bans, one of the most popular sunglasses brands in the world. The glasses came from the US Air Force's request to create aviation sunglasses that would prevent glare and distraction caused by intense light distortion higher up in the atmosphere. The US Army Air Corps Colonel John McCready contacted the manufacturer Bausch & Lomb, which primarily worked in the medical equipment industry. The first viable prototype had anti-glare glass and a metal frame that was dubbed the Ray-Ban Aviator, due to its ability to minimize both ultraviolet and infrared exposure. Number 20, the US military made an improved version of Velcro. Another popular invention that we might not be able to live without is Velcro. However, for all the good it does, being able to stick and unstick with relative ease, Velcro has a huge flaw. It's loud. Originally, that might not be much of a downside. However, when you're deep in the trenches or trying to get some sleep, pulling on a strip of Velcro can easily give away your position or wake up battle-weary troops. That's why the US military has designed a Velcro alternative that looks and functions pretty much the same, yet is roughly 95% quieter than normal. If you're interested in buying some military-grade Velcro for yourself, tough luck. The US military hasn't revealed the patent, making this invention one they're willing to keep. Number 21. The US used PlayStations instead of a supercomputer. While the US military is a big spender, it's done its fair share of trying to cut back on some of the less necessary costs. Thus, when it came time to make a new supercomputer for the Air Force in 2010, the government tried a few out-of-the-box and off-the-shelf approaches. Enter the PlayStation 3, costing roughly $400 per unit at the time. 1,760 of these gaming consoles were stripped bare and the central processing units put together to create a cohesive supercomputer, named the Condor Cluster. It was estimated that the entire computer cost $2 million. If that sounds like a bit much, just wait. According to some early estimates, the final price of the computer was only between 5 and 10% of what it would cost to make the supercomputer from scratch. Number 22. The Soviets weren't impressed with Bikini Atoll testing. The nuclear bomb testing at Bikini Atoll was widely considered one of the pivotal moments in preparing the US for the Cold War. Even today, Bikini Atoll remains uninhabitable due to the level of background radiation in the area. There were quite a few accidents during the 12 years of testing. The first tested bomb actually missed the target, while the first hydrogen bomb ended up being more than twice as powerful as predicted, which would revolutionize the world's understanding of what nuclear warfare could do. However, the US Army was fully confident in its successes when testing the bomb, so much so that it invited the Soviets to watch. One of the observers who was in charge of determining the uranium content for Soviet bombs suggested that the entire testing process seemed pointless. Apparently, the Soviets believed that since they already had bombers that could reach the US, all the testing was pure posturing and a poor attempt at intimidation. Number 23. The military uses depleted uranium. Speaking of nuclear forces, the US military has been using leftovers from nuclear fuel as ammunition. Depleted uranium has largely been stripped from radioactive elements. However, it's still incredibly dense and reactive. Bullets with a depleted uranium tip become sharper on impact and can also ignite after contact. Since they're not as radioactive, bullets and armor made from depleted uranium are considered perfectly legal for military use, and there are no treaties or countries that ban them. The main use of depleted uranium in the forces has been as anti-tank weaponry. Due to its incendiary properties, a bullet can ignite the fuel cells or detonate stored ammunition inside the tank. Number 24. There has only been one fight between the US and the USSR. Despite the constant terror of the Cold War, the US never actually ended up going to war with the USSR. But the two countries did end up clashing in the air. The circumstances of said fight were made even stranger by the fact that it happened before the Cold War and while the two sides were still technically allies. The confrontation happened close to the Serbian city of Niš. On November 7, 1944, the US 82nd Operations Group was tasked to provide air support to the Red Army troop convoy on the ground. In what appeared to be a lapse of communication, the 82nd wasn't aware that the Red Army convoy advanced 60 miles further than intended. When the Lockheed P-38s spotted a convoy of soldiers and vehicles, they mistook them for German forces and opened fire. The Soviet convoy flagged friendly planes to the rescue, escalating the confrontation to both air-to-surface firing and a dogfight. The Soviet planes realized that the attackers were Americans 15 minutes in, then backed off and showed their own red stars on the planes to clear the confusion. The US military officially apologized for the mistake that ultimately caused at least 31 dead, 37 wounded, 20 trucks burned, and 6 total airplanes lost between the two armies. Number 25. The military is shrinking. but possibly for the better. We've spent a lot of time discussing the rich history of the US military, but what about its future? Well, some experts paint a grim picture of the look of the US military a few years or decades from now. According to a 2022 estimate by the US Department of Defense, 77% of all men eligible to enter military service, i.e. between 17 and 24, would be disqualified from joining. The most common reasons for the disqualification were drug use, obesity, medical conditions, or a significant criminal record. Roughly 44% of them will be disqualified for 2 or more reasons. Of course, the US military is volunteer only, so the prospect of all men being available isn't exactly relevant. But even then, roughly 87% of young people who were surveyed stated that they had no interest in being in the Army. The US Army has been consistently failing to reach its recruitment goals for years, falling short by as many as 25% of its quota. Furthermore, recent allegations of racism and sexual misconduct, as well as mistrust in the extent and quality of veteran care, have made many young adults wary of serving in the military. This isn't a particularly new trend either. The US military was at its most recent peak all the way back in 1987, but the number of active personnel has shrunk by roughly 40% since then. Remember when we discussed 150,000 recruits each year? That number was 360,000 in 1980. The trend isn't isolated to the US either. Many European countries report facing similar issues. This has created an interesting juxtaposition in the US military, where the primary source of recruits is families who already have 1 or more members in the military. But it's not all bad news. The US military has been revamping several of its branches to be more efficient and rely on less manpower overall. For example, the US Marine Corps force design, expected to be implemented by 2030, should cut 12,000 personnel and reduce the number of aircraft at the branch's disposal. The prominence of drone warfare, as evidenced in the Russo-Ukrainian war so far, makes it even more likely that the US will double down on using robots instead of soldiers to reduce the potential of losing human lives to war. Additionally, the US has unveiled a future soldier preparatory course, designed as a remedial program for people who wish to join the Army but are unable to meet the entry standards. The course is expected to take in 20,000 recruits in 2024, allowing the US military to claw back some of its recruitment losses. Finally, most other countries have lowered their military personnel numbers, and the US is still in NATO. The US is also part of the Quad, with India, Japan, and Australia, putting more pressure on China, one of its biggest geopolitical rivals. Even if the US military didn't have the overwhelming advantage, which it still largely does, it could rely on its allies to project a unified force. What do you think about these facts about the US military? Let us know if we missed a particularly juicy one. Leave your comments in the section below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out how aircraft carriers prepare 17,000 meals a day, or click this other video instead.